My name is Mary Kanmi Udanico. I'm the director of the Weglyn Endowed Chair for Multicultural Studies. So wonderful to welcome you all to our second fall Weglyn event. We had one on Tuesday. And today's event is exceptionally special because we've been trying to organize this for about 3 years. And so during COVID and post-COVID, so it's such an incredible process. And I'm so excited to see your faces here. Just quick thing about Weglyn. I shared this on Tuesday and I have to correct myself because I stated that the endowment was set up in 1999, but actually Michi and Walter Weglyn Endowed Chair was set up in 1993. And sadly, 1999 was the year that Michi Weglyn passed away. Walter and Michi Weglyn were incredible friends of Cal Poly Pomona, and that's why we have this endowment that allows us to do programming, also offer students an opportunity to participate in experiential learning. We've taken students to see shows and wanted to take more students in, but then COVID happened. But it's really geared toward what we today call justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. And back when they established it, they referred to it as multiculturalism. Michi was a survivor of the Japanese internment camp, and Walter was a survivor of the Holocaust. They met in New York, fell in love, and Michi went on to become a designer for the Perry Como show, and Walter was an esteemed perfume chemist. But through all that, their own life histories and biographies reminded them how important it is to give back and to fight for justice. And Michi's book, Years of Infamy, that she wrote, really helped to lead to the redress movement for Japanese Americans who were forcibly interned after the bombing of Pearl Harbor and after the signing of Franklin D. Roosevelt Executive Order 9066. Many of you may know that we live adjacent to former internment concentration camps. For example, the Fairplex was also an internment camp, as well as the Santa Anita racetracks, and they're all over this area. So we live in obviously indigenous lands and the Tongva tribe. And, I think it's really important for us to recognize the work that so many of our elders and ancestors have done. And I think Michi and Walter really wanted to make sure that we continue that legacy of justice work. I am really excited to introduce Dr. Alvaro Huerta. I don't know where he went. He's probably busy work. Oh, he's right here. Who is the faculty associate for the Weglyn this year, and who has been an incredible partner in organizing this session for us today. And so he's going to make the introductions, but I wanted to welcome all of you and thank you for being here. And I know that you will learn lots, gain lots, but hopefully build community. So thank you and welcome.
Applause to Dr. Danico, because she's my boss, so we need to be nice to her. I'm going to get a raise because of this. And then she fed us too, so that's nice. Muchas gracias por todos estar aquí. I'm going to say that in English. Muchas gracias por todos estar aquí. My name is Dr. Alvaro Huerta, and I'm an associate professor here at Cal Poly Pomona, Ethnic and Women's Studies and Urban and Regional Planning. I'm a Mexican, so I have 2 jobs for the price of one. I'm also a fellow at Weglyn, and I'm an organizing fellow at the Harvard Divinity School. So I'm very proud to be in a space with y'all. I always say y'all like Britney Spears. Y'all, free Britney, because I don't like to say you guys. And it's one of the most amazing events that I've organized in all my life. I've been organizing since I started UCLA in 1985. I was 7 years old. I was like a child prodigy, so I'm not that old. And the 3 speakers that we have today are amazing. But before I announce them or introduce them, I just want to say thank you to Dean Hawthorne for allowing us to use this space in the library. Thank you to Chris for helping organize this, all the logistics in the library. For Marilu, always doing a great job with graphic designs. And and all of the amazing people at the dean's office in the both spaces. And also thank you for those that clean our spaces when we're not here. A lot of times we enter these spaces, but there's brown people that come at night and make these spaces clean for us. So we have to thank them too. And for those that clean our restrooms, for those that serve our food, for those that cut our grass, you know, those that are on the margins, those that are people that are invisible when it comes to making this university a great university. So I've been here 10 years. And before I got here, it was like an okay university. It was like, but now that I'm here, it's a great university. When it was founded, it was all white men. Even the horses were white. And now I see brown and black horses, so I'm happy about that. This is a beautiful event, beautiful people here in attendance. I'm gonna fail half my class because they didn't show up. Anything in regarding Cal Poly Pomona, what brings us together and our strength is our diversity. And we're talking about a group of people. There was only 2 groups of people, okay? Only 2 groups of people. I did get a PhD, so I must drop some knowledge, that were not allowed to organize. They weren't given the right to organize formally when unions were allowed to organize over 100 years ago. Domestic workers, like my mother, and farm workers. So when unions won the rights to organize and not get killed and not get sent to jail, because that was the case when they protested and they organized against railroads, against factories. When we as workers won the right to organize, farm workers were excluded. And during that time, we're talking Mexican farm workers. We're talking Japanese farm workers. And then there's a hidden story that most of us do not know because we weren't taught in our schools, because you didn't take my class, that Filipinos were very important in terms of their role as farm workers in California. So there's that hidden story that we want to tell today. And this is why we come together, is to talk about not just Mexican immigrants, not just Filipino immigrants or Japanese immigrants, but how these groups come together, in particular Filipino and Mexican during this time, in coalition to fight against the growers, to fight against racial capitalism, to fight against systemic racism. So this is what it's all about, is for us to take advantage of the university, to bring these wonderful people in a space to teach us about that history, because they were there too. Right. And our first speaker is Marisa Pulido. She's a Filipino American who has organized in this space with farm workers and others that need our help. Our second speaker is going to be Ken Wong. Ken Wong is director of the UCLA Labor Center. I've known Ken, for many years, the similar spaces in terms of people that believe in organizing, people that believe in human rights. And then our last professor, or our last speaker, is a Professor Jose Calderon. He's a retired professor at Pitzer College. He's going to speak about also the movement within the UFW with Ken and Jose worked with the UFW with Cesar Chavez and others and the organizing, but also bringing in that coalition history that we were not taught in our schools. And so that's why we're here today. And this is all because of Weglyn and the wonderful work that they're doing and creating these programs for you as students, our future leaders. Right, so this is why we're here, because Jose's generations, Ken's generations opened the doors for my generation and Dr. Davila and others that are here, Dr. Vallejo, we're opening doors for your generation in terms of people that look like us can belong and feel belonged in these spaces, and then speak out for those that do not have a voice. Speak for those like our parents, our grandparents, those that are on the margins. So with that, our first speaker, Marisa Pulido, muchas gracias.
I'm going to go rogue and take the mic if you don't mind, only because I need to see the screen. Okay. I usually have notes, but I'd rather not look at the paper. I'd rather look at you, the audience. So thank you. My name is Marisa Pulido, and thank you, Dr. Huerta, for that introduction. Broncos, right? Cal Poly Pomona, my goodness. This is great. So nice to see all of you here. Wow, for you guys to take time off of your studies, your classes, to be here with us in this space. Thank you for being here. What I want to present to you is information that probably not a lot of you have heard before. So to start off, I wanted to just find out how many of you here in the audience are Filipino. All right, great, well, welcome. And if you're not Filipino, that's all right. In fact, I'm glad that you're here because you're going to learn something about Filipino-American history and our glorious, glorious contribution to the farm labor movement. I know a lot of you know Cesar Chavez, Dolores Huerta. Those are household names. We have holidays. We have postage stamps, parks and schools named after them. However, a lot of you don't know, probably cannot name maybe one or two of the Filipino-American farm worker labor leaders who actually started the movement. So I'm going to go into that all in detail with my PowerPoint. And we are pressed for time. I understand that. So if I gloss over it, don't worry, because I believe it's being recorded, so you can also refer to it later. All right, I'm getting a thumbs up from Chris. Thank you. So yeah, keep in mind, I'm going to really skate through it because I will have other esteemed fellow speakers on our panel, which I am so honored to be here in their company. All right, so we'll go ahead and get started. I want to just go over briefly. There's waves of immigration, Filipinos that came to the United States. And what I'm focusing on strictly is the first wave. These are called the Sicados, the Manongs, from 1906 to 1946 time period. Okay, there's other waves that are listed there, but I will not go into those because we don't have time for that. That's not our focus. All right, so this first wave of Sicados and Manongs, they came between 1906 and 1946. Okay, they left the Philippines. They were recruited to specifically work the farm, agricultural farms, okay, specifically in Hawaii and the Philippines. Okay, and during that time period, the numbers vary, but approximately 110,000. Okay, so quite a few young men recruited. The Sicados is a term that we refer specifically to those young men who immigrated to Hawaii, okay? Not the US mainland or Alaska, but Hawaii, okay? And that term in Filipino, in the Philippines, actually literally means migrant agricultural worker. So they just took on the name Sicada. So whenever you hear the term Sicada, it's specific to Hawaii, okay? And once again, they were recruited for farm labor in the sugar and pineapple plantations. One of the main leaders to come out of that time period was Pablo Manlapit. Remember that name. And notable is the strikes that went on way back in 1920, 1924. So this predates the Mexican farm labor movement, okay, of the 1960s. Way back to 1920, 24. And if you think of that, the history and the time period of America and Hawaii at that time, one of the notable strikes at that time when they were unionizing was the 1924 sugar cane strike in Kauai. And very historic, we're coming upon the centennial celebration, 100 year of Hanapepe Kauai massacre, where 16 Filipino plantation workers were killed, murdered, thrown off a cliff. Okay, that's how they died. Very tragic. Moving on, the Manongs. The Manongs are specific to not Hawaii, but the mainland, US, California, the Pacific Northwest, Alaska, even the Southwest, Arizona, New Mexico, where they are specific to that time period, 1920. Okay, so not 1906, later on 1920 to 1935. And they're called Manong because most of them were from the Ilocos region of the Philippines, the northern mountain area of the Philippines. And that term literally means older brother. So in the Filipino culture, we have a lot of terms for respect. We definitely show our respect to our elders. At that time period was the 1924 U.S. Immigration Act. And during that time, it's all this yellow peril going on. Sorry. Okay, and during that time, there was an exclusionary law that Chinese, Japanese, and other Asians could not immigrate to the US. So what happens when there's no more influx of laborers coming in from Asia? There's a void in the manual labor, okay? So, of course, the US government, they're always trying to change the laws, change the policies to benefit their, to their own benefit. So they said, hey, these Filipinos, they're known as nationals, okay? They're not part of this Immigration Act because of the relationship between the US government and the Philippines. They had a special relationship that the Filipinos coming to the United States, their status was called nationals. Okay, they are neither citizens, they are not undocumented aliens. Okay, so because of that, they allowed more Filipinos to come in to just compensate for that void in the manual labor workforce. So during that time, the profile that they specifically recruited young men, uneducated. They wanted to make sure that they didn't have any, fantasies of unionizing or binding together to form coalitions. They wanted to make sure they're uneducated, they couldn't read or write. Strictly young men, strapling young, who could work the fields. Okay, and these migrant workers, once again, came to California, Oregon, Arizona, New Mexico, Alaska, and Washington to the fisheries and the canneries. I want to give you an idea of the hardships that these young men had to face. Not only think about being from a foreign land, coming to America, all of that in itself, but on top of that, the history at the time period was the Great Depression in our country. Jobs were scarce. Because of that, there was a lot of animosity, maybe that's a kind word, towards brown men, young men, Filipino men. And I want to say unspeakable acts of discrimination, racial discrimination and prejudice, okay? Beyond anything that I can ever fathom in my lifetime. So because of this, they were restricted to living. They couldn't, get property, rent places to live. At the poverty level, what can they afford? They were restricted to what's called the labor camps. At the growers' ranches, they just had barracks, basically, little plywood shacks made of wood scraps, no plumbing, no toilet, no running water, and the cots that were just lined up a foot apart. What a life. They've probably had in their mind coming to America with the streets paved with gold. What a harsh wake-up call, right? To have to live this life and not even have the basic human, basics that we take for granted nowadays. So all of that they were facing, all these hardships, on top of working back-breaking hours, 12-hour days, hot sun, extreme weathers in the Central Valley, all of that added to their just not a good life, not a happy life. On top of that, Filipino women were not allowed to immigrate with them. The recruiters only wanted single young men. Remember, no children, no ties, no families. Because of that, there was a 14-to-1 ratio of men to women. So they were strictly a bachelor society. And they had no families, no children, nothing to tie them down, which was ideal for the growers. These migrant workers just come and go, work the farms, go to the next town. Think about this. I don't know if you've heard the movie Loving, anti-miscegenation in America, where people of color were restricted from marrying outside of their race. These young single men are in the prime of their life. Okay, great, good-looking men, suave dressers, with the zoot suits, the hats, the whole nine. They love to dance. I don't know if you know about Filipino culture. Everything's a party to us. We all love to eat and dance. So these young men in the 1920s of all time periods, right? The great, jazz swing era, All they had to do was go to taxi dance halls where they could socialize on the weekends after a long, hard week of work, hang out with some women to dance, the night away, and then go back to work on Monday again. So because of this, there was a lot of animosity towards the Filipino brown men. There was a lot of race rioting going on, okay? Violent race rioting going on. The most infamous is the anti-Filipino race riots in Watsonville. Look it up, 1930, a gentleman by the name of Mr. Furman Tobert was murdered. Okay, they sought out the Filipinos in the labor camps while they were sleeping. Just sleeping, minding their own business, just sleeping. Because of all the animosity and jealousy towards Filipino men dancing with white women, okay? We hear Jim Crow in the South, the African American experience, that whole civil rights movement. Filipinos experienced it, let me tell you. Up and down the West Coast, I'm sure maybe you have stories in your own families, but think about this. Stockton, 1930, a hotel saying, positively no Filipinos allowed. This was a photograph from Look magazine. I had to cite my source. Don't want to, just want to make sure that this is known. But there's a lot of other places, public places, where they also had a sub sign underneath and dogs. No Filipinos, no dogs. So that's what they had to face. Welcome to America, right? Despite all of this, wow, these Manongs, these young men had the foresight to organize, to know that they need to band together, stick together, never mind the differences, what regions they're from, what dialects or different languages they spoke. They knew right away they had to stick together by necessity. So they formed early on, way back in the 1930s, unions. Filipino Labor Union, Salinas Valley strikes were successful. Filipino Agricultural Laborers Association. Later on, they changed their name. The F became Federated because they wanted to be more inclusive of other races, okay, not just Filipino. And most notable in Stockton was the asparagus strikes. And get this, the growers, okay, the landowners who own the ranches and the farms, the growers recognized their union and their power for collective bargaining. That's key, because a lot of unions at that time in the 1930s, they didn't have that kind of power to sit down at the table and negotiate. That's never been heard of. And you're talking about young brown men who were illiterate and couldn't barely speak English. Wow. It amazes me and it inspires me. And this is what my passion is, my drive is, because the Manongs had so little, and they accomplished so much with what little they had. Okay, and there's 30,000 members strong. I don't know about you, but sometimes on campus clubs, it's hard to even get like 100 students to come to a meeting. But you had 30,000 farm workers ready to sit down, talk, and do business. So by the World War II, things changed for the Filipinos a little bit. Wow, because a lot of them were drafted. And you think, well, how can this happen? They're nationals. They're not even citizens and they got to fight this war. Yes, they actually enlisted. Okay, maybe some were drafted, but they wanted to fight because they wanted to go back, defend their home country, the Philippines, from the invading Japanese forces. So they had the 1st and 2nd Filipino Infantry, started in 1942, participated in combat. Okay, and then because of this, their service in the U.S. Military, they were allowed citizenship. Okay, you think things are going to get better? We're hoping, right? What we have now is the Bracero program at this time before World War II. Bracero program is, like I said, the U.S. government always trying to change the laws to their benefit, right? So before World War II, Public Law 78, they allowed farm workers in Mexico, Mexican citizens, to cross the border legally to do their work the fields, seasonal work, and then go back home to Mexico. Free and clear, no questions asked. It's all legal. However, at this time, the growers started paying braceros more than the local workers. Local meaning Filipino and Mexican U.S. citizens. Those that served in the war, those that are military veterans. Wait a minute, what's going on here, right? Hey, I do understand the purpose of the Bracero program. Work needed to be done. Our neighbor is Mexico. This is Mexican land. But you can understand, it's like a kind of like a, what's going on here, right? There's both sides to every story. So that's what I want to make a point of, the Bracero program, and that you guys are aware of what happened. And this, if you can understand, from the 1920s, the Monongs experiencing all of this, and then this slapped in their face after pretty much laying their life on the line to fight for America. Wow, you can see, like, I'd be really disgruntled by now, don't you think? I'd be like, something needs to change, something needs to improve. What are we gonna do about this? So what we have is, in 1950, Agricultural Workers Organizing Committee, AWOC. This was AFL-CIO. A lot of unions back then weren't AFL-CIO. And they were formed in 1959. Their organizer was Larry Dulai Itliong. Remember this name, okay? Manong Larry, as I affectionately call him, Manong, out of due respect, organized 1,500 Filipinos. He was part of that whole Manong generation who worked the canneries in Alaska and Pacific Northwest in Seattle. Finally, in his mid, probably 30s, came down to the Central Valley and started organizing AWOC. And their successful strike was in Coachella, May 3rd, 1965. Okay, because they said, this is it. We at least need a pay increase. That's all we're asking for. We're not asking for anything else. We're migrant. We're going to work here. We're going to leave. Work and leave. But at least pay us a decent wage. So they finally agreed, the growers, to pay the Filipino AWOC workers the same amount as the braceros. Wow. You think that that would already happen? No, it took a fight. It took a strike. It took organizing. And that was Manong Larry. Sorry, Chris, I'm like probably throwing you off. My apologies. Okay, so Delano grape strike, Cesar Chavez is known for this. September 8th, 1965 is when it actually started, and not with Cesar Chavez, but with Manong Larry Itliong and AWOC. 5 more minutes, okay. So 1,500 Filipino workers struck, they voted, and they hit 4 grape vineyards, and Itliong moved his AWOC quarters to Delano. Now, this is just the Filipino side. What about all the other workers? It wasn't going too well the first week. Growers are bringing scabs, Mexican workers to break the strike. Larry Itliong, the mastermind of the grape strike, said, hey, I'm going to go over to Cesar Chavez and talk to him and ask him with the NFWA to join us in our strike. Cesar said, no, there's no way we can do it. We don't have enough money. Maybe another 2 or 3 years we'll strike. So finally, Larry Itliong put it down the line. He said, hey, you guys don't join our strike. When NFWA strikes, Filipinos are going to break your strike. So it's like back and forth, and that's what the growers want, divide and conquer, right? You guys all learned that? Okay, so that's the history. September 8th, 1965, the grape strike started with the Filipinos. And 8 days later, on Independence Day, NFWA voted to finally join the strike, despite Cesar not really wanting to do that. Larry Dulai Itliong, there's not too much written about him. You can find him on the internet, but there's a children's book that just came out. I put a little resume of him. He became assistant director to Cesar. Okay, so second in command, and we'll go over that soon. Later on, he left the union because he felt that the Filipinos were marginalized, a minority within a minority in the union, and so he therefore decided to leave. But he went on to do very significant work in the political arena with the Filipino community. Please watch, for more information, Delano Manong's documentary by my good friend Marisa Roy, 2014. It's out there. It's a PBS documentary. So AFL-CIO, finally, August 22nd, 1966, okay, after about a year of the strike, AWOC and NFWA finally merged together, and that is the birth, that merger of the Mexican farm workers and the Filipino farm workers merging together gave birth to the United Farm Workers Organizing Committee, AFL-CIO, thanks to AWOC. Okay, and because of the numbers, Filipinos were outnumbered. Cesar Chavez became director. Manong Larry Itliong was assistant director. Really quickly, I talked about he left. This was the breakdown after Manong Larry left. The 2 Filipinos that were left, Philip Vera Cruz, second vice president, and Manong Pete Velasco. Another book that's very important, Manong Philip Vera Cruz, which Mr. Kent Wong had worked on at UCLA, Labor Study Center. And that's the cover, what it looks like. It's out of print, probably about 3 different printings, but it's so popular, so look for that. And I just want to briefly say that Monong Philip was another mastermind, you know, well-spoken. He was educated, came here to study, but ended up in the field. Amazing man. And I'm so blessed to have the last few years of his life to meet him and spend time with him. Prophets and Save the World, in the book, his poem. I had, once again, the honor for him to read this poem to us as college students at UCLA, visiting him in Bakersfield and Delano. Another Monong, Pete Velasco. Okay, he stayed with the Union till he died. One of Cesar's very good friends, and lived in La Paz, in Tehachapi. A picture of Monong, Pete and his wife, Monong Dolores, and she too was dedicated to the movement, dedicated to United Farm Workers. They stayed loyal to the end till they died. Agbayani Village, upcoming 50th anniversary. The retirement home, because these elderly Filipino men didn't have families, nowhere to live. Monong Larry made sure that he developed plans for them to have a retirement home with the support of the Union and Cesar Chavez. And this is from Johnny Itliong, Monong Larry's son, who's a good friend of mine, wanted me to contribute this slide as showing the plans. It was just called Philippine Village back then, that his father helped develop. Picture of the Monongs in their later years at Agbayani Village. And then this is a group of us from UCLA in the 1990s. We would spend spring break or any vacation time that we had from our studies to visit the Monongs. It's like visiting your relatives, your grandparents, going to maybe a convalescent home. That's what it felt like to me. We wanted to spend as much time as we could in their twilight years. We were their grandchildren or their children, you know, surrogate because they didn't have families. Agbayani Village Pilgrimage Organizing Committee, which I represent and co-founded with my brother Mark Pulido. We made several trips with UCLA students, high school students, visiting Agbayani. This is a picture of Monong Felix Arroy. He is the grand uncle of Marisa Arroy, who did the Delano Monongs documentary. And just a group of students and high school students who wanted to hear the Monongs story firsthand. Thank you so much. I know I went over time, but I do appreciate your time. All right.
Stole the mic. That was amazing. Applause, everyone, again. I mean, literally, we have an associate dean here, so let's recruit her to teach a class on this subject, because this is a subject that is so valuable, and it's something that we miss and we missed in our education. Dean Akers, she's the dean at the ENV College. She's Filipino American. She wrote an amazing book on Filipina street vendors. She wanted to be here. She couldn't, but she thanks the speakers for talking about this amazing event. Also, I just want to acknowledge we have 2 amazing interpreters. We want to be inclusive, and we want to make sure that everyone is welcomed and all people feel that they belong as well. So actually, my father was a bracero, and I do agree that the growers pitted the braceros with the UFW and the Filipino workers, and I'm against guest worker programs. But that's an experience that they too experience exploitation, and were sprayed with DDT and others. But the capitalists are very effective in dividing and conquering our people. Next up, Mr. Ken Wong is going to speak about his role in his history in this movement, and then he also has some video clips he wants to share.
Thanks very much, Alvaro, and thank you, Mary, and the other people that put together this program today. And it is so timely in the midst of an extraordinary upsurge of worker organizing all across the country. We are in the midst of a powerful strike being led by hotel workers right here in Southern California. We are in the midst of a powerful strike by writers in the entertainment industry, by actors in the entertainment industry. We are now witnessing a strike of the United Auto Workers against the 3 major auto corporations in this country, and Kaiser Permanente may be going out on strike. So this is an extraordinary time of worker organizing, of worker activism, and it is under these conditions that it's very important to look at what has gone on with regard to organizing victories, organizing lessons from years past. I'm the director of the UCLA Labor Center. I teach labor studies and ethnic studies at UCLA. Previously, I was staff attorney for the Service Employees International Union here in Los Angeles that has been at the forefront of some of the most successful organizing campaigns in the country, including the Justice for Janitors, including the home care organizing. And SEIU is the fastest growing union in the country because of their commitment to organizing. And my beginnings in the labor movement were when I was your age. I was a student at UC Berkeley as an undergraduate. And that's where I first met Monong Philip Veracruz, who was an organizer with United Farm Workers. He had come to our college classroom to speak about the United Farm Workers movement. And when I saw him come up on stage, he had his ruffled hat, he had his worn clothes, his face was lined from years in the sun. And he didn't look like the other guest speakers that we had at UC Berkeley. But when he got up to speak, his message was compelling and inspiring. And it was he the one that shared the stories of the Filipino farm workers, of organizing the Delano grape strike, and how indeed it was a merger between the Mexican-American and the Filipino farm worker organizations that led to the birth of the United Farm Workers of America. This is a part of our collective labor history that very few people know about. And even though I was a boycott organizer for the United Farm Workers, I didn't know that history, that indeed the Filipinos at one point were the majority workforce in the fields of California. And before them, it was the Japanese. And before them, it was the Chinese. So indeed, there has been a long tradition of exploitation and abuse of immigrant workers within the U.S. workforce. I just returned early this morning at 2 o'clock in the morning from Washington, D.C., where I participated in the very first activity at the U.S. Department of Labor in their national office honoring 72 Thai garment workers who were held in slavery in El Monte, California, right up the street. 70 Thai garment workers were held in slavery. And although this campaign took place over 20 years ago, the sweatshop conditions within the garment industry continue to this day. And the current acting director and Secretary of Labor for the Department of Labor is my good friend Julie Su, who is the lead attorney on that case, who has dedicated her life to eradicate sweatshop conditions and to end exploitation and abuse of workers. So it's very fitting that in this very week, when we honor the Thai garment workers, that we are gathered today to celebrate the organizing that has taken place historically within the fields of California based on multiracial unity. When I became the director of the UCLA Labor Center, I worked with Marissa's brother, Mark Polito, and a whole team of us put together this book, Philip Veracruz, A Personal History of the Filipino Immigrants and the Farm Workers Movement. And so this was a really breakthrough publication that captured the stories of not only Philip Veracruz, but of Larry Itliong, of Pete Velasco, and of the generation of Filipino farm workers who built the union and who organized against immense obstacles to build power for farm workers. And back in 1992, we had the founding convention of the Asian Pacific American Labor Alliance in Washington, D.C. We had 500 Asian American union activists from all over the country. And at that founding convention, we honored Philip Veracruz to celebrate his contributions to our labor movement and to the U.S. working class. He had never before been acknowledged by his own labor movement, even by his own union. And so the fact that we were able to bring together a broad-based alliance of unions and community organizations from all over the country to honor Philip Veracruz meant that we understood our history and that we understood this was an opportunity for us to work together to carry on the work of the Manong, to carry on the work of those that have gone before us to build unions. And this is the latest publication that I just put together, Asian American Workers Rising. And it chronicles the 30-year history of the Asian Pacific American Labor Alliance and the extraordinary untold stories of Asian American workers who have fought and who have built this country, who have fought and have built this labor movement, and yet have never been honored or recognized or celebrated for their contributions. So for young people today, for young people in college, I think this is a very exciting time for the labor movement. We see 200 Starbucks stores across the country organizing for the first time in history. We see warehouse workers organizing in the Inland Empire for the first time in history to form and join unions. We see gig workers and workers in the informal economy, Uber and Lyft drivers organizing unions for the first time in history. And even within the University of California, the largest and biggest strike in the history of higher education took place in November and December, and our graduate students won a 46% wage increase based on that act of solidarity. So this is what students today can do. You can organize, you can get involved, you can help to build power for working people, you can fight for justice. And so I reflect on that day when I was an undergraduate at UC Berkeley, when I first met Philip Veracruz, when I first became a boycott organizer for the United Farm Workers, that has changed my life, that has allowed me to be a part of a broad-based labor movement that fights for economic and social justice, that demands an end to exploitation and abuse in an era where corporate greed is unparalleled, where Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk are spending billions of dollars on a joyride in outer space as their workers are dying from COVID. That is the level of callousness and greed reflected in corporate America today. And this is an opportunity to organize, to change, to build a society that embraces the philosophy of nonviolence, that embraces peace and justice, and that will build the type of society that serves workers of all colors. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, Ken. I mean, literally, we're two deep, profound speakers. I wish they do us the honor of writing their autobiographies, and so we can learn more about them. And it's just amazing how these circles, they come together and in unity. Ken has been a leader in the labor movement, for several decades, and continues to be an inspiration for us all. And last, mi compadre aquí, Jose Calderon, who gave me a C+ in when I was a student. So I'm still upset.
Oh, one thing about Alvaro is that es un mentiroso, and he thinks he's a comedian también, But I do want to thank the organizers, the Michi and Walter Weglyn Foundation, and especially Alvaro and Mary Danico. We've been trying to put this together for a while. And, it comes at a time when we just celebrated September 16th. And we all know that's Independence Day. Of course, we haven't gotten into the real independence, but when in, the Spanish were really kicked out of Mexico. And it was a tremendous victory in terms of the unity of indigenous people, Black, mestizo together, who won that victory. And so that is a meaning for September 16th. But it was also, as Marisa pointed out, that on September 16th, 1965, when we had an example for all ages and for all movements, when the unity of the Filipino great workers belonging to the Agricultural Workers Organizing Committee and the Mexican workers and those of other nationalities of the National Farm Workers Association came together, a unity that eventually led to the formation of the United Farm Workers Union and the winning of numerous contracts, dignified contracts. At the same time, as part of the 50-year anniversary, that is this next year, of Agbayani village, we also celebrate and commemorate the historic conditions that led to the development of the Palo Agbayani Filipino Retirement Village in the early 70s. And then the lessons that Kent has been pointing out that are applicable today. You know, I have to share with you, I've really been going through a period of time right now. I've written about 70 articles, 3 books, but I've been going through a period right now, and my wife Rose is here, knows this. I carry out every morning about this many books. And I've been studying science lately. And I just finished a book by Bernard Cohen called Revolution in Science. It's that thick, 710 pages. But I want you to know that in that book, even though they mention everyone from Galileo to Copernicus, Ptolemy, all the way to Einstein and on, there is not one mention of one Latin American, one African, one AAPI, no one from our indigenous communities, as though we have not contributed to science. So in my studies, I have been attracted recently to the work of such scholars and organizers, such as Paulo Freire in Brazil, the work of Orlando Falsborda in Colombia, and his work on participatory research and bringing out the history of women leaders, peasants, such as Juana Julia Guzman, who led the takeover of land of the peasantry in Colombia, and then developed cooperatives and new forms of survival. But what these two and so many others from the Global South had in common was that those in power in both the Global South and the Global North consciously and consistently left out what we can call people's science, the science of the people. The acts of using research, teaching, learning, and organizing as tools to create methods and models as alternatives to colonialism, as alternatives to patriarchy, as alternatives to our attacks on anyone who is of a different sexual orientation, and what is the foundation of the divisions created among our oppressed communities by those in power. So our new way of thinking is bringing to center stage those who have been historically excluded and to advance a people's science. And I urge all of you who are right now at this time in your thinking to really see yourself as a scientist, that those problems out there, like medical doctors, that we can analyze them, we can diagnose them like a medical doctor, but we can find solutions. But the most important part about people science, social change science, revolutionary science, is that we go one step further, and that what we find out in terms of those problems, that we organize to change those conditions which are creating those problems, and try it. And sometimes we make mistakes. We often make mistakes. Come back with science as to higher levels of learning to get to a point where we can create systemic changes and new forms of reconstructions. And that's what we call it, a reconstruction of knowledge, critical recovery of our grandfathers, our grandmothers, our sisters and brothers in the past who gave so much of their lives, that shifts the center to include the experiences of those who have been included, who have been excluded. And that's what they're trying to wipe out right now. Ethnic studies, gender studies, LGBTQ studies, critical race theory. This is what it's all about. The outlook is that in understanding the particularity of our historical experiences and the foundations of our oppression, such as the Filipino farm workers, such as the Mexican workers, the slaves who were brought and built this country. I mean, if they paid them for reparations, it would be in the billions of dollars. But using that particularity as a foundation to build coalitions and a genuine unity to change the systemic, overarching political, economic, and social issues that affect all of us. Now, that's the trick. How can we really understand, for example, the particularity of a particular group, but at the same time bring people together? When we do that, when we understand each other's oppression, we can really begin to have genuine unity. That's different than just going on a weekend and holding hands and singing De Colores and Kumbaya, but really based on understanding that history. Now, like you pointed out, Mary, the Michi and Walter Weglyn Foundation is an example that is named after individuals who were examples in the academic sense, with Michi Weglyn producing a book, Tears of Infamy, the untold stories of America's concentration camps, but also in the participatory sense, because they not only took their research and put it up in a library, but Michi and Walter used their research, their pedagogy, and their organizing to then help advance a movement that eventually led to reparations for more than 80,000 Japanese Americans interned during World War II. They also exposed the kidnappings, and a lot of you don't know about this, of thousands of Japanese Latin Americans who were forced to serve as prisoners of war during that time. It is in that context that we need to bring to center stage the history of Mexican workers and the history of Filipino workers, how their homeland was colonized. And I want to really emphasize this. The foundation of the immigration issue right now has to do with countries being colonized, those workers being worked to death in corporations, and those that you didn't use, you forced them to cross across the rivers, and then once here, they work as day laborers, they work as immigrants, their labor again once exploited. The foundation of that, if you study it, is colonization. Their labor was used in their country and abroad, and they were ultimately really excluded, not only from history, but excluded in the books we read. So, you know, I want to just add some examples of what we have in unity with Filipino workers, for example. All of you know that Mexican workers, that the historical roots of their oppression lay in the U.S. annexation of the Southwest in 1848 and the penetration of Mexico by U.S. capitalist interests. The Treaty of Guadalupe was signed supposedly to protect property rights, language, and culture, but after 1848, that treaty was broken, and our Chicano-Mexican workers and families were faced with discrimination, loss of land, and democratic rights. This included immigration population control in the 1920s, the deportation of 500,000 Mexican origin people, with half of them being US citizens, right here in Los Angeles on the trains being deported back to Mexico. The Bracero program, as you pointed out, Marisa, between 1951 and 1965, justified to meet labor shortages during the war, but really the real foundation was to serve the needs of corporate growers. And ultimately then the rise of farm worker organizing through such unions, and you mentioned all the ones that emerged way back then for the Filipino workers, but there was also the National Farm Labor Union, led by such leaders as scholar Ernesto Galarza, because when he graduated from Berkeley, he went to work out in the fields and to organize unions in the 1940s and 1950s. And Emma Tenayuca, a woman who led the pecan sheller strike in Texas, one of the largest strikes in the nation. Similarly, it was colonization that forced 100,000 Filipino men to leave the Philippines for Hawaii during the first 30 years of the century. And this Study it. This was the result of the Spanish-American War in 1898 and the making of the Philippines a colony of the U.S. between 1898 and 1946. The Filipino labor was used there. And like you pointed out, Kent, when the U.S. Immigration Act was passed, excluding people from Asian Pacific countries to immigrate to the U.S., West Coast farmers, with the help of the U.S. government, turned to importing Filipinos who, because the Philippines was now a territory of the U.S., were exempt from anti-exclusionary laws. So now you use this to use their labor. By 1930, 100,000 Filipinos were working in Hawaii and the mainland U.S. They too met oppression and racism, and I won't go into that. You pointed it out as a result of this colonization. But like Mexican workers during the Depression, there were race riots in the camps with Filipinos being blamed for taking jobs from whites, a similarity that is happening to us now. With Filipinos included in the California race marriage law, of course, it was written mainly against African Americans, the anti-miscegenation laws, not allowing them to marry outside their race. Although the Supreme Court ruled against it in 1945, most Filipino men, especially those working in the fields, never married. Further, it was not until 1946 that Filipinos were allowed to be naturalized citizens, allowing for more importation of Filipino workers. So I don't know if you know this, but in the San Joaquin and Salinas Valley of California, there were thousands there who were and came to be 53% of the agricultural workforce in that region, 53%. And so, like you said, today we remember Pablo Manlapit, who I'm sure most of you have never heard about until today, who was a leader in organizing one of the first Filipino labor unions in Hawaii that involved thousands of plantation workers between 1920 and 1924. And some of them were deported over here to the San Joaquin Valley. And what the growers didn't know is that some of those workers had already been trained in organizing in Hawaii. These are some of the historical commonalities that we bring to you today that brought Mexican origin leaders like Dolores Huerta, Cesar Chavez, Helen Chavez, and later Jesse de la Cruz, Jessica Govea, to organize along Filipino origin leaders such as Phil de la Cruz, Lariat Leong, Pablo Manlapit, and my brother, Pete Velasco. The conditions of grape pickers in 1965 is pointed out. They only made 90 cents an hour with no health benefits. Workers having no water, no bathrooms in the fields, being forced to pay $2 a day to live in unheated shacks with no indoor plumbing or cooking facilities, and segregated by race. This brought forward the need for organizing. When farm workers demanded the simple demand of $1.25 an hour, and the growers refused, it was the Filipinos who were the first ones to go on strike. And when the growers brought in scabs to break the strike, AWOC and the National Farm Worker Association came together in a meeting on September 16th, resulting then in over 30 farms going out on strike. Imagine for a simple thing like bathrooms in the fields. Thousands of farm workers leaving the fields, and the foundation then of a union that brought the two together. These were the early seeds of 14 million people in the country, ultimately supporting the Great Boycott, and growers forced to sign contracts with the United Farm Workers Union that resulted in an end to the abusive system of labor contracting, a rise in wages, the providing of fresh water and toilets in the fields. If you drive throughout the San Joaquin Valley today, you will not see any fields without bathrooms and drinking water. A medical plan and the banning of DDT and other pesticides such as dildren and aldrin. And we know how important the DDT banning is, because the studies have shown that the average age of farm workers, they die at the average age of 49. And one of the reasons is that once you get DDT in your body, you pass it on to future generations. That's the result of colonization and historical oppression. Many of those victories, especially water and toilets in the fields, medical and pension plans, and bans on pesticides, continue today. That's what we celebrate today, brothers and sisters. What also continues today is the designation of Agbayani village as a national monument. And it was named after Paulo Agbayani, a Filipino worker who died on the picket line in Delano in 1967. And how many of you today know the name of Paulo Agbayani? This is an example to me of what is left out of our history book. Similar to many Mexican immigrant workers, many Filipino workers lost all contact with their families and their homeland. And when it came time for them to retire, they had no place to go. This aspect of losing all contact with their families is well documented in a book that I'm sure many of you have also not read, a book by Carlos Bulasan, which is an example of critical recovery. America is in the heart. It was out of this reality in the early 1970s that the UFW, with the help of many students at the time, such as Pomona resident and civil rights leader, Luis, please stand up. If you could give Luis a big hand. Luis today is a leader in Pomona, but I have to tell you, when he was a student at UC Santa Barbara, we're talking about the early 70s, he went and helped to start brick by brick building Agbayani Village, as other students did. Another one, by the way, was Judy Chu, who is now a congresswoman. And their names are on a plaque in Agbayani Village. Well, they found that Luis knew construction and he was such a good worker that they talked him into staying. And unfortunately, Luis was never able to finish his degree. A lot of people don't know, even in the city of Pomona. We honored him at our Cesar Chavez breakfast. They honored him in the 40th anniversary, remembering those who, brick by brick, helped to build Agbayani. So thank you, Luis, for your work. This next year is the 50th anniversary of Agbayani, and I have to share that it has a special meaning for me, because for 30 years, I have been taking students every spring to La Paz, Delano, and Agbayani, just like you, Marisa. In the beginning of our first visits there in 1994, some of the Manongs were still alive. One of them was Brother Fred, and we would document their history. We'd eat with them. We'd talk to them. This has not just included students from Pittsburgh College, but from 2004 to 2006, when I was here in the Michi and Walter Weglyn Endowed Chair. I co-taught a class with Professor Gilbert Cadena, where we took students from Cal Poly to La Paz, Delano, and Agbayani. And there's an article in the book, Race, Poverty, and Social Justice, that we wrote in here, which document how many of the students who went then framed the pictures of the Manong and also even wrote their histories. One of those students, Laura Aquino, made a film. She discovered, she didn't know this, first time she went, that her grandfather was one of those Manongs. And she has on YouTube, you can see it. It's called Ang Samula, on her experience, the experience of her grandfather and its history. So let me finish. This unity exemplified by Mexican and Filipino workers back in 1965, and the unity exemplified in the diversity of students and community people in constructing Agbayani has continued over the years. With Brother Pete Velasco and his wife, Dolores, visiting the Pittsburgh campus in 1965. Both have passed away now. Dolores just passed away last year. Every time we crossed that creek, she would have a sign welcoming our students. Brother Pete, when he came to speak on the campus, all the students just loved him. And when he went back, wrote a 27-page letter to the students saying that this was one of the brightest moments in his life, because he was not just treated as a farm worker, but he was treated as a scholar. And sort of a payback was when Brother Pete died, Dolores called us and said, you know, Jose, Brother Pete loved the students so much that he asked before he passed away if they would come and carry his casket. We took 3 van loads and carried his casket. And on the way back, Dolores running after our vans and some farm workers gave us roses. And if you go today to Pitzer and the back of a Grove house, you'll see where the students have put up a bench in the name of Brother Pete. And those roses behind the bench, it's called the Farm Worker Garden, made by a worker. You'll find the roses that remember the life of Brother Pete. That is the kind of unity that continues today, that we share with you, with students, that we need to continue on our campuses with those facilities workers, those dining hall workers that are often forgotten. So if you go to that Grove House now, right next to it is another bench, because we found that on the campus, every time a dining hall worker dies or a facilities worker dies, there's no mention. Nobody knows about it. A professor dies, wow, they have something in the auditorium, it's in the news and everything. So the workers there and the students got together. They not only unionized all the workers at Pitzer, the workers at Pomona, the workers at Laverne University, but now there's a bench right next to the other bench that has the name of every facility dining hall worker that has died in the last years. And every time a worker dies, the parents and the students get together and they hold a memorial. So when we talk about critical recovery and bringing history to the forefront, these are examples in practice of how on our campuses we can really bring forward those histories. Just to finish, most recently, we have been all part of marches from Pomona to Los Angeles to beat back the blame for the coronavirus on our AAPI communities. You know that. They blame it on the Chinese, and it's resulting in violence and killings in our community. At the same time, we have immigrants and refugees from the global south being scapegoated for the economic wars abroad, forcing thousands to leave their homeland, just as our Filipino and Mexican immigrant brothers who you know. And all of you know right now, 3 Republican governors are implementing a strategy proposed by Trump back in 2018 to bus and fly thousands of immigrants from the border cities to places like Los Angeles. Actually, Los Angeles just got its 14th bus. This xenophobic strategy is now part of the main election campaigns of right-wing politicians, such as DeSantis and candidates who are placing the immigration issue at the top of their agendas. So today, in remembering what is happening to divide us and to suppress our vote and to not use our power, let us celebrate the legacy of our Filipino and Mexican workers and the unity of Agbayani in putting a stop to these divisive strategies. Let us work together to stop the hate, to stand together in support of our AAPI communities, our immigrant families of all colors, our farm workers, our unions, to build multiracial unity, and most importantly, to not just deal with the symptoms of racist rhetoric and hate, but to turn around the underlying causes of racism, to turn around the systemic and historical forces of colonization, racial and economic disparities that have pitted us one against the other to fight just for a few meek resources that they throw to us, and to respond as we are doing here today, to advance a movement that will ensure the use of our labor and our future children's labor and our contributions and our resources for our quality of life in the interests of our communities. And I say, please say viva after me. Long live the legacy of the unity of our Filipino and Mexican workers. Que viva! Que vivan los trabajadores. Que vivan los estudiantes. Que vivan las mujeres. Y que viva nuestra comunidad. Y sí se puede.
Muchas gracias, Jose. Voilà. 2 individuals were very helpful in supporting us today. The directors from the Cesar Chavez Center and also the Asian American Pacific Calendar. So if you can just stand up, so everyone applause. So they co-sponsored this event, and they're helping us organize an event next Thursday for the Brown Berets. It's a screening, a movie screening on Thursday at 6 o'clock at our theater here. So I just wanted to acknowledge them because it's important for y'all as students to get involved in these type of organizations because they're there for you. So what we're gonna do, given the time limitations, we're gonna show a 2-minute video, and I would like if Mr. Ken Wong, after the video is shown, if he can comment on that. Because of the cameras and everything, it's better to come to the mics. And we're gonna respect everyone's time. So about 2 minutes before 2:30, we'll have Dr. Danico make some closing remarks. So we can show the video.
Started to change in 1965. Filipino farm workers in Delano, California decided they'd had enough. They wanted decent pay and humane working conditions in the grape fields, and they wanted it now.
We feel that we farm workers should have an organization of our own.
So the Agricultural Workers Organizing Committee, led by Larry Itliong and Philip Vera Cruz, began the Delano Grape Strike, a movement that would change the course of farm worker labor organization. How did Filipino and Mexican-American farm workers spark a worldwide movement for better labor conditions? It started in California's Central Valley, the breadbasket of the United States. Farm work has always meant low pay and poor working conditions. But it all started to change in 1965, when Filipino farm workers in Delano, California decided they'd had enough. They wanted decent pay and humane working conditions in the grape fields, and they wanted it now.
We feel that we farm workers should have an organization of our own.
So the Agricultural Workers Organizing Committee, led by Larry Itliong and Philip Vera Cruz, began the Delano Grape Strike, a movement that would change the course of farm worker labor organizing history. Up until this point, farm owners had pitted one ethnic group against the other as a tactic to break up the strikes. Knowing they needed the support of their fellow farm workers, Itliong and Vera Cruz went to Mexican-American organizers Dolores Huerta and Cesar Chavez and asked them to join the strike. And from there, solidarity in history was born in the fields between Filipino and Mexican workers that led to the historic 5-year-long international grape boycott. The power of solidarity that backed this movement echoed around the world. Families across America stopped eating grapes. Black activists of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee walked with the farm workers on a 300-mile march from Delano to Sacramento. Yemeni workers and Native Americans, all too familiar with state-led marginalization, supported farm workers. And faith leaders preached the movement's message of justice. After 5 years, the strikers won. Grape growers agreed to union contracts that ensured better working conditions and higher pay. Filipino and Mexican farm workers found unity in their fight for labor protections and formed a coalition and movement from which a vision of solidarity and collective power was created. Power to the people. Isang bagsak.
Okay, so to conclude, we're just going to have, given the time limitations, Mr. Ken Wong will comment on the video that he brought to us, and then we'll have Dr. Danico make some closing remarks, and I'm sure our guests will be available if anybody wants to have one-on-one questions.
Great. So I just wanted to emphasize that this ongoing solidarity is still occurring. And tomorrow, we are celebrating the 95th birthday of Reverend James Lawson Jr. I've been teaching a class on nonviolence with Reverend Lawson for the past 20 years at UCLA. He turns 95 tomorrow. And on Saturday, he will be joined by his good friend Dolores Huerta for a nonviolence teach-in at Holman United Methodist Church from 9 to 12. So if anyone wants to come and meet these two extraordinary social justice, civil, and human rights leaders, Reverend James Lawson Jr., 95 years old, Dolores Huerta, 93 years old, please join us Saturday, Holman United Methodist Church at 9 o'clock. Thanks very much.
Can we give our three incredible speakers a round of applause? Cal Poly. And thank you for Alvaro for helping to moderate. Because of time, I wanted to see if anyone had some burning questions that they wanted to ask. If not, you can come up and speak with them. One of the things that you may not realize, you're actually in a room of legends. You know, the people that we read about in history books that we're like, we wish we could have met them. You're in that space right now with some of our incredible, you know, it's for in your generation, probably your like elders, my generation, my peers, of folks who've actually been doing the work as scholar activists, who have been transforming and transferring this knowledge to the next generation of folks to continue to work so we can have the privileges that many of us take advantage of, right? And take it for granted. So I really want you to just lean into this moment right now. And remember, like later on, 10 years, 20 years from now, you're going to say, oh my gosh, I met them. You know, I met Marisa Pulido. I met Kent Wong. I met Jose Calderon. And then, yeah, we met some other Cal Poly Pomona faculty too. No, but I mean, seriously, sometimes I do that. I'm like, oh my gosh, I can't believe I'm friends with Jose. No, I mean, I literally do that, you know, because these are things that we don't realize. This is such an incredible honor that all of you are here with us today. I encourage you to come and dialogue with them if you're a little shy to ask questions. I encourage you to exchange contact information because believe it or not, these people will connect with you, right? They're very much community centered, people centered. And if you want to participate in change making, you're in the right place. If you want to make a place in a world that you want to leave the next generation a better place for them, where their rights are protected, that they don't, I mean, not that we're going to solve the world problem, but at least together we can fight for that, because sadly we still have a lot of fighting to do. So thank you so much for coming. And there is a QR code. I ask you to fill out an evaluation if you can. If you haven't signed in, the QR code counts as both things, but we want your feedback. And if you would like to have these folks back, let's hear you with the enthusiastic cheer, so maybe they'll come back. And thank you so much. I encourage you to dialogue because I think for time, it sounds like there's time constraints. Come up and ask questions. Please take in the moment. Bye.